All right, then. Welcome to the today's lecture of the Society for Intercultural Philosophy, and I particularly welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Stephanie Rivera Berruz. She's an associate professor of philosophy at Marquette University. She was the recipient of the Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellowship for her work on Latin American philosophy for the academic years in 17 and 18. And her main research interests lie in Latin American philosophy and feminism, as well as philosophy of race, gender, and sexuality. She recently co-edited an anthology called Comparative Studies in Latin American and Asian Philosophies, published in 2018. And other publications appear in Hypatia, Inter-American Journal of Philosophy, and Essays in Philosophy. Originally from Bayamon, Puerto Rico, Dr. Rivera Berruz has lived both inside and outside of the continental United States. She credits her migrations as inspirations for her interests in philosophies that explore myriad dimensions of identity. And that's what interests us. And I'm very glad you're going to talk to us about part of your research tonight. And the lecture is entitled Ofelia Rodriguez Acosta on Modernity, Love, and Progress. Having said this, Stephanie, the floor is yours, and welcome again.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share a little bit about what I've been up to research wise. So I'll share my screen here in a second, but I just wanted to say that what you're getting here is I guess technically the third of a book project that is due to my editors in September. So you all I was very happy to get the invitation. It gave me a deadline, a self-imposed deadline to get this kind of this work ready for presentation. And so, like I said, it's part of a broader project. I'm more than happy to talk about the broader project, which is a conversation between three Caribbean women intellectuals who were writing at the same time but never met. One from Puerto Rico, her name is Luisa Capetillo. One from Cuba, which is the one I will talk about today, Ofelia Rodriguez Acosta. And then one from the Dominican Republic, Evangelina Berruz Rodriguez, which will be the kind of the last chapter, closing chapter of the book. So happy to chat more about how all of that hangs together if anybody has any questions, but just to give a little bit of framing. All right, let's see if this works. Does it work? Yes, I think it does. Okay. Everybody can see my screen as a PowerPoint perfectly. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. All right. So Ofelia Rodriguez Acosta on Love, Modernity, and Social Progress. One kind of tentative title. The tentative title of the broader book is called On the Border of Belonging, a philosophical dialogue between Ofelia Rodriguez Acosta, Luisa Capetillo, and Evangelina Rodriguez Berruz. The images you have here in the back are actually images of Ofelia, and they're pulled from the archive of a newspaper that she for. I'll talk about it in a sec, but there's a lot of images in this PowerPoint that are pulled directly from the archival sources I've been working with to author the chapter. So these two, she was on the cover of one, and so this is the image of her. All right. Okay. So Ofelia Rodriguez Acosta was born in 1902, died in 1975. She was born in Pinar del Rio, the westernmost province of Cuba, in the city Artemisa, a place of birth that would seem to predict the values she would come to embody. And if you can look on there's a map there for you. You can see that Artemisa and Pinar del Rio in particular are just west of La Habana, to just orient us in space. She articulated an economically independent life sustained by her writing and never married. She was one of the most productive Cuban writers of her times. And yet, to date, we have scant personal details of her life. We know she was a daughter of a magistrate, that she had a sister who was also a writer, and not very much about her mother. However, she was a notoriously prolific writer Her first book, Evocaciones, was authored when she was 12, and she was also an ardent feminist activist. As a result, the record of Rodriguez Acosta is traced in the diction of her works and the memory of her actions. She wrote 7 novels, 1 book of stories, a series of chronicles and essays, and 1 play. Most importantly, for the purposes of this chapter that I'm talking to you about today, she was a prolific journalist and contributed to some of the largest circulating magazines in Cuba during her time, Bohemia, Carteles, Social, and Grafos, as well as other local newspapers, Diario de la Marina and El Mundo. She also founded her own magazine in 1927, Espartana. Her activism is traced in her ardent anti-Machado stances, which were also published in Bohemia in the 30s, as well as her participation in a labor union for women and in El Club Femenino de Cuba as a librarian, which she held that position from 1923 to 1928. Rodriguez Acosta passed in 1975, although her place of death remains unclear, as some accounts indicate that she died in La Habana and others in Mexico City. Oral accounts of her biographers locate the possibility of her death in Mexico City, as she resided there after 1940. However, her death certificate and her obituary locate her in Cuba at the time of her death. Regardless of location, what remains consistent in the biographical accounts, oral or textual, is that she died in a mental health institution. Despite the scant biographical record, Rodriguez Acosta had great relevance in the years spanning 1920 to 1940, which were central in the formation of Cuban national imaginary. She was a public intellectual figure, although she remains somewhat of a forgotten figure in the post-revolutionary Cuban archive. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that after the revolution in Cuba, the state efforts to tell a story about feminist practices cohered around state politics. And so the story of Ofelia basically got lost in there because of the positions she held. And I mean, I think this will become a little bit clearer as I move along, but that's another kind of reason. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the feminist politics and feminist movement politics of the time. So Rodriguez Acosta lived out her ideals in a very unwelcoming world. She was a clear example of a militant feminist to the best of her capacities. She held radical positions on free love in the face of Catholic social doctrine that understood love as a social problem, which will be what I'll talk about today. She ardently argued that the subordination of women was the result of social norms that restricted women's liberty and not the result of biological inadequacy. She defended the need for women's economic independence, grounded in freedom of education. And she was a socialist feminist that consistently saw the role of labor inequity in the construction of social oppression and the way it cuts across women's lives in the creation of dependency on men through the social convention of marriage itself. Finally, she was an active resistor of the Gerardo Machado dictatorship, 1925 to 1933, through her defense of student activism and the construction of a notion of hacer patria, or making motherland, as a future-facing project for which we must actively strive and prepare for in the present. As will become clear in the pages that follow, Rodriguez Acosta's radical interventions in gender and politics visioned a future for human social progress with a unique and equitable role for women in the construction of modernity. She was, as Madeleine Camara, who is one of the kind of lead scholars on Ofelia, writes, quote, obedient to the demands of modernity, yet rebellious in the face of its ineffectiveness for rethinking femininity. Okay. So modernity makes landfall in the Caribbean in a kaleidoscope of ways, engendering contradictions from the underside of its possibilities. Colonization of the Caribbean makes modernity possible. For a figure like Rodriguez Acosta, modernity was a participatory horizon key to social progress and historical transformation. Belonging in modernity was necessary, but as it stood from the moment she was writing, had to be deeply reformed given its exclusionary and inequitable formation. Hence, she ardently advocated for venues that place women central to the human unfolding of social progress. Women had a unique role to play in modernity because of their creative capacities. She was, as I will argue, concerned with problems that have to do with social reproduction of nations, seen in her ardent commitment to a nationalist project of social progress heavily informed by currents of naturalism. Thus, at times, we witness a lot of contradictions between what it means for women to participate in a national project and at the same time a call to disavow the norms by which said national project was originally constituted. In this context, gender shows up as a problem of both woman and man, albeit for different reasons. And in the end, Rodriguez Acosta advocates a perspective that challenged the very definition of woman that would also, by extension, redefine man. She grounds the redefinition in her search for the human as an equalizing agent. It's the human and its natural relation to life that sets the stage for the type of social progress that she was imagining. The human is at the same time defined by the project of modernity, ushered in by colonization in explicitly exclusionary ways. Not everybody was considered human, and certainly not a subject that women could hold necessarily. Nevertheless, for her, the nature of a human life was to be lived, to be studied, to be suffered, and most importantly, to be confronted. It's no surprise that one of her most famous novels would take on the title, and it's featured there on the PowerPoint, La Vida Manda, which was published in 1929, which loosely translates to Life Commands or the Commands of Life, as it brings to the fore the way life operates out of our control. And the best we can do, as Rodriguez Acosta would have it, is to face it, to confront it, and live it the best we can, striving toward more equitable futures by reforming oppressive structures in the present. So in this kind of chapter project that I'm presenting you today, I'm tracing Rodriguez Acosta's political philosophy with an eye toward her formulations on love, freedom, and social progress. I'm interested in how these three sites hang together. She dedicated a lot of ink to them too. So they're connected. Ultimately, I want to show that in the tense intersection between her radical critiques of gender norms, grounded in her analysis of love as a social problem, and her utopic visions of modernity and progress, we find deep and rife concern with problems around social reproduction. That is, the conditions that make life and its commands possible in the first place. To do so, I focus heavily, although not exclusively, on her writings from her feminist campaign in Bohemia, which circulated a weekly column from the years spanning 1930 to 1932. So she had a weekly column. She published with Bohemia extensively throughout her life, but during these 2 years, she had a weekly column that was called La Campaña Feminista, or the Feminist Campaign, where she was writing every week about some issue related to women, although when you start looking at the archives of what she wrote, most of it has to do with broader social and political concerns, and gender issues. They're in there, but they're not as front and center as you would expect with a title like the Feminist Campaign. So, and I'll talk a little bit about how that happens or why I think that happens. So following the work of Gloria Garcia Peña, whose book, The Borders of Dominicanidad, is featured on the PowerPoint, I'm interested in Bohemia because it offers a window into the language and meaning of the historical moment in which Rodriguez Acosta is writing. It's a space that can, in one breath, sustain hegemony by producing the narrative of nation through violence or exclusion, and on the other hand, work to contest the boundaries of belonging at the same time. So Bohemia was the largest circulating magazine at the time, about 50,000 copies weekly, and tracing the evolution of her thought over the course of 2 years in this column, I think, is what helps me kind of navigate what she's up to. Yeah. So the other kind of final thing I'll note here is that Ofelia had, like many writers, different eras of her writing. And so the journalism and La Vida Manda really marks kind of a younger years while she's still in Cuba, but during the Machado dictatorship. And then there's a whole other era of her writing where she starts focusing on writing novels, I mean, existentialist novels specifically. She moves to Mexico City. So she has periods of writing. I'm focusing on this one for the reasons I just noted, but I just want to also flag that, I mean, because she was so prolific, we're looking at an author that had very, very expansive in what she was up to. Okay. So Rodriguez Acosta's feminist position is grounded in gender as a main axis around which subordination occurs, and difference emerges along class lines, which is unsurprising given her reliance on Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, and Angelica Balabanov in her entries. Although this also entailed a negligence in engaging race directly, which for her shows up as a class relation between oppressed and oppressor. For instance, she had an entry titled La Raza Humana, or the Human Race, published July 17, 1932, where she notes that racial difference will merely be a historic episode that'll be overcome by the human race. In this way, we witness that Rodriguez Acosta is firmly rooted in a universalism, largely indebted to Enlightenment thinkers, that structure how she's thinking through belonging to modernity and the progress she wishes to see in its unfolding. Moreover, it's precisely this universal move that allows her to argue that feminism is not about women's relation to man, but rather about confronting the realities and struggles of life. Her consistent return to life and its demands and commands as a theme in her writing undergirds. Lost my spot. There we go. Undergirds her commitments to a naturalism that in the end saw human life as having shared struggles. Pain and struggle give us a sense of living, she argues, and affirms our duties to responsibility over our actions. For Rodriguez Acosta, no other topic reflects the truth of this claim more than love. Love is a social problem. Rodriguez Acosta explains in an interview with Berta Arrocena de Martinez Marquez, published in Bohemia, April of 1930. And so that's what you see here on the left-hand side. That is the interview that was published in Bohemia. The University of Florida has the archives of Bohemia all digitized. So if anyone's ever really interested in seeing this firsthand, I think over 30 to 40 years of digitized archives of this magazine, because it was so prevalent and common and important for Cuban national politics. Okay, so this is the interview. And so in this interview, it comes out shortly after the publication of La Vida Manda, right, which is 1929. And so in the interview, she gives readers perspective on the main character of the book, La Vida Manda. The character's name is Gertrudis, whose life unfolds in the face of struggles and loss of loves. And I use loves there plural. The loss of partners, the loss of family. She was orphaned, and the loss of a child who only lived a few hours after it was born. Gertrudis, whose name is itself an homage to an earlier Cuban-born feminist, Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda, is the embodiment of the practical feminist ideals that Rodriguez Acosta is interested in as she enacts a morality in a world unprepared for her choices. The novel traces her rocky path as she attempts to embody Rodriguez Acosta's ideals of economic independence, sexual freedom, and an intellectual life, all of which result tragically. In many respects, the struggle and tragedy that characterizes life in the corpus of Rodriguez Acosta materializes through the character of Gertrudis as she's confronted with loss, love among these. And so as readers, we're witness to the development of this position in the interview with Martinez and Marquez, as well as in her writing in Bohemia. As the interview closes, she notes that feminism is more than a change in situation to a woman's life. Rather, it is accompanied by a change in consciousness, born out of a demand for justice, rooted in love, generosity, and humility. So conceptually speaking, love connects gender and sexuality. It's mediated by gendered norms that dictate what is acceptable or decent in intimate relations. Love foils sexual norms that regulate women's lives, demarcating the limits of moral worthiness. During her time, the moral worthiness of a woman was read up against the discourses of prostitution and children born out of wedlock, which respectively flagged the limits of a woman's social belonging. Sex, as Stoller and Cooper argue in Tensions of Empire, is about control over bodies and cells, as well as their consequences in the forging nation, itself a contested terrain. In the context of colonial authority, sexuality is linked to politics via policies that can secure and maintain the polity itself. The post-independent state of Cuba that Rodriguez Acosta finds herself writing in is heir to these dynamics and rife with concern over the making of nation on the heels of the consequences of colonial sexual violence. Hence, who is deemed worthy of participating in the nation is a central concern, but one key mechanism for making said determination is through the regulation of gender, race, and sexuality, as race cannot be divorced from the reproductive processes that make a people possible. So although Rodriguez Acosta does not explicitly discuss the matter of race in her work, as I previously noted, I do want to suggest that it's not at the table of her discussions, that it not be at the table of her discussions, given the importance that she places on thinking about sexuality through love, marriage, and family. None of these social political locations of analysis are divorced from race, even if her focus ends up being class. In discussing love as a social problem, Rodriguez Acosta is threading the material intimacy that makes social reproduction possible through the mechanisms instantiated by the institutions of marriage and family, both of which she was very staunchly critical of. She's opening a window into the sets of relations that structure intimacy on an individual and broader structural level. And so in what kind of follows, what I do is I thread her critiques on love, marriage, and family as attentive to social reproduction, and thereby existing in this kind of tense and yet intimate space of concern over social progress and modernity itself. Okay, so citizenship and national belonging more broadly, require the policing of sexuality and gender to constitute the body politic. The mechanisms of policing are not merely symbolic, but rather material practices that through individual action, policy, and public discourses, as well as state intervention, aim to consequentially impact the formation of nation. As Jackie Alexander has argued, the policing of the sexual has to do with sex as an act itself, but it also has, quote, powerful signifiers about appropriate sexuality, about the kind of sexuality that presumably imperils the nation, and about the kind of sexuality that promotes citizenship, end quote. And I understand Rodriguez Acosta's attention to love, marriage, and family as concern over social institutions that mechanize and materialize the norms of gender and sexuality, and I would also add race in the background, fundamental to the constitution of a post-independent nation. And it's further to draw attention to the conditions by which marriage and family making become meaningful endeavors that were central aspects of senses of self, as well as collective identity making. Marriage regulates the norms of love through the stipulations offered by the Catholic Church in her context, through the heteronormative presuppositions of state contract formation, as well as reproductive imperatives for women. However, the desire to participate in marriage is foiled by economic needs for stability, as well as the discourse of modern social progress that saw the epitome of a woman's life really in marriage. Rodriguez Acosta is staunchly critical of marriage, both because of her anti-clerical stance, but also as a problem of economics and wealth. Like she saw marriage as a transference of wealth. And she argues that marriage is held in place by bourgeois norms that hold wealth and its transfer possible. So marriage is an economic endeavor that holds the norms of intimacy in place, so much so that in the absence of economic stability colored by poverty, entail that marriage and the norms of family, for instance, monogamy, do not show up in the same manner. For her, the question becomes how to enact norms of intimacy or love in line with what she understands as modern social progress that at the same time equalize access to economic stability. In this space lies the tension. For on the one hand, she launches a critique of the norms of sexuality that are fundamentally oppressive, and at the same time, she seeks to codify those norms through the terms offered by modern nation building, which at its core are set up to be exclusionary. Not everybody can participate in the nation. So to be modern in a woman might just mean to be something quite impossible for her times. And so what I do here is that I break down her articulations of love as a social problem into three subcategories that I think kind of overarchingly give us a feel for the what I'm describing about her claims. The first one is beyond fidelity to a man. The second is the right not to love. And the third is love is and labor. So love, the relationship between love and labor. And my hope here is to showcase the depth with which she's thinking about love as a social problem, such that it becomes a viable way to also trace her general political philosophy and also her broader philosophical and political commitments, as she was also an activist and proper activist on the ground. Okay, so to the first one. And so this is the piece that I'm going to most readily cite is this one for this section. So, all right, so as a social problem, Rodriguez Acosta notes that the norms of love are undergoing shifts at the hands of social progress. So in La Mujer de Hoy y el Amor, The Woman of Today in Love, this was published September 21st, 1930, she spells out what she takes to be this characteristic shift, which has to do with the place of love in a woman's life, rather the options for structuring a life available to a woman with respect to love. She notes women have historically had one of two options with respect to exploring love in their lives, marriage on the one hand or adultery on the other, both foiled by living in virtue of social Catholic norms that made marriage the normative route of intimacy for women, positioning adultery as the only other available option for exploring sexual freedom. Love, she argues, has forcibly occupied the whole of women's lives, whereas for men, love is merely an episode or an aspect of their lives. However, with the shift in norms, women now have new avenues that allow them to live more full lives where love is not the driving feature Importantly, the modern woman has come to understand that undergirding love is a legitimate claim to pleasure, which has at the same time made her sentimentally independent from man, which allows her to make room for other interests. Love is not the defining feature of life, and hence neither should be marriage. As a consequence, she understands the importance of opening up to broader concerns of the times, which change the focus of her consciousness, much like the consciousness that she was talking about in that interview. The shift in the norms of love make it possible for us to see that women have a social responsibility much more important than fidelity to a man. Importantly, those responsibilities that she's concerned with have to do with the progress of the Cuban nation and the promotions of virtues aligned with appropriate citizenship for national belonging. Insofar as it is framed in terms of opening space up for women to modernize through her participation in national social progress, rather than have her life defined in and through marital status. So Rodriguez Acosta relies on the way she links feminism with activism, that is what she calls a practical feminism, committed to broader goals of social equity that characterize her political commitments. Love is not, nor should be, the end-all be-all of a woman's life. And the reality of that fact also involves recognizing that love is relational. And changing the ways we think about love, Rodriguez Acosta calls her readers to think about how love involves a practical knowing of how to maneuver social relations. It is an open-ended practice. However, it's not a practice with an ultimate end, but rather always ongoing. And it's for this reason that we should not be surprised that she is interested in changing the norms of love, but also linking those commitments to social and political commitments that engender practices of liberation and freedom. Hers is a project rooted in practice, and to the extent that these practices transform self-other world relations, then we can start to see how shifting love can also involve shifting other sets of relations that cut across the conditions for belonging to modernity and the nation that unfold from within this historical milieu. And so in sum, love should not be about fidelity to a man, but rather about the capacity to opt in and out of love, about the place it is given in a woman's life, and about the regulation of love through institutions demands the eradication of the possibilities. And about the way the regulation of love through institutions demands the eradication of the possibilities of other life projects. She really wanted, and you see this come to life here, she really wanted women to not just become educated, but become educated with the goal of becoming political and becoming political participants in whatever was going on. She wasn't really demanding anything outside of that. But one of the things that shines through on this piece is that love and marriage seemed to occupy such a central role that she was like, if we could just eliminate this thing, women would have time to read and educate themselves about what is going on at the level of the nation, and to see that, life should not really just be beholden to this one thing. So, I mean, and this is, I think, kind of one of the things that you see in this piece, but you see it threaded throughout most of her reflections on love as a social problem. Which brings me to the next point, which is the right not to love. Okay, so a little bit about the images you have here. The bottom right will be where what some of the citations. The top is a short story that was published in Bohemia, which I'm also going to talk about in here. And that story, one of the pieces actually references this film called This Modern Age, which is, I think it was 1931, film in the United States. So she's just kind of giving you a sense of what the images that you're looking at before I jump into this next section. So love as a social problem, or the right not to love. So in an entry, El Derecho de Amar, the right to love, published May 24th of 1932, Rodriguez Acosta describes the problem of love as one better understood through the right not to love. Echoing the entry that I was just kind of talking about, which was actually published a year before, she explicitly advocates the right to love freely as a right to choose not to love. And so here I've provided you her writing in English and then my translations. So I'll read them in both, but just so you know. So she writes, I don't know if there's any Spanish speakers in the room. El problema no es ya cómo resolver su vida individual en orden a sentimientos, sino cómo solucionar sus sentimientos en orden a una vida colectiva. The problem is not how she resolves her individual life in line with feeling, but rather how to resolve feeling in line with a collective life. Her defense of a right not to love is grounded in an analysis of a paradox of love showcased in a recent film called The Modern Age, 1931, as well as the US film industry of the time, which showcases for Rodriguez Acosta the paradox of the right to love freely versus the right not to love. Through the film, she notes that the modern woman, the free spirit who champions the right to love freely, is always set up to fall in love with a morally bankrupt character. The gangster. The gangster exemplifies the extremes of US capitalism and all of its bourgeois moral depravity. Hence, the possibilities of choosing not to love become vital as it leaves room for alignment between personal practices and broader political commitments. If practice and commitment do not align, then Rodriguez Acosta questions the place of love, thus provoking the possibilities of choosing not to love. And so she asks, this is the second quote. ¿Es posible aislarse en el placer cuando hay tanto niño nacido en la premura de una unión de los que apenas tienen tiempo para abrazarse entre jornadas extenuantes de un trabajo que tritura el alma, el cerebro, la carne y la vida? Is it possible to isolate yourself when there are so many children born in premature unions of those who barely have time to hug between work shifts so strenuous that they crush the soul, the mind, the body, and life? Love cannot be divorced from broader political commitments, thus grounding the claim that love is a social problem. It is a social problem about how people relate, couple, and reproduce. Hence, it cannot be divorced from economic concerns, concerns about liberation and freedom, or concerns about moral commitments. And she knew this long before love entered into the feminist philosophical canons as a lens through which to analyze the relationships between power, labor, and reproduction. To this point, her short story, so this is the one on the top, called La construcción de un hijo, The Construction of a Son, which was published September 14th, 1930, anticipates some of these claims on the right to choose or not to choose love. The story opens with the following lines. He aquí la historia de una mujer independiente que sigue su propio camino de manera inflexible, sin desviarse por el medio al que dirán. Here's the story of an independent woman who follows her own path unwaveringly. Without straying for fear of what others might say. The story traces the journey of the character Virginia, who desires to have a perfect child. So she approaches Esteban, a man described as embodying physical perfection, with a contractual procreational proposition. Virginia is clear that she desires maternity exclusively and finds in Esteban a physique commensurate with her eugenic goal of bearing a perfect child. She makes clear that the exchange is merely contractual and justifies her desires on rights given to her by life and science. Esteban agrees. Subsequently, the narrative shifts to a courtroom scene whereby the reader learns that Esteban, upon learning of Virginia's success in bearing a perfect child, is legally claiming the child as his. If Esteban is successful, the illegitimate non-matrimonial nature of Virginia and Esteban's relationship would entail Virginia be denied maternal rights. And in fact, Esteban has failed the contractual terms as he has actually fallen in love with Virginia, and his desire to legally claim the child is an act of vengeance for his own decision to participate as an instrument of procreation. And so as she writes the conclusion of the story, and this is the kind of the last quote that you have right here, toda tragedia biológica de la mujer no le daba derecho a la maternidad libre y responsable. La conclusión del abogado defensor llevaba implícitas el fallo del tribunal. Los magistrados se aligeraron en él de la carga inútil del problema. La moral estaba salvada, la justicia soportaba con sonrojo la vergüenza del atropellado cometido en su nombre. La mujer madre se desangraba por toda el alma. Every biological tragedy of womanhood denied her the right to free and responsible motherhood. The defense attorney's conclusions implicitly carried the court's verdict. The judges swiftly rid themselves of the burden of the problem. Morality was preserved. Justice, however, bore with the shame of the weight of the offense committed in its name. The woman mother was left bleeding from her very soul. End quote. So the story of Virginia is emblematic of Rodriguez Acosta's claims on the right to not love, as well as the tensions and the possibilities of its articulations. Virginia is emblematic of the liberated woman that Rodriguez Acosta seeks to chart a path toward, yet she's met with a world unfit for her desires, even if they coincide, albeit problematically, with the production of a eugenicist claim of the formation of a perfect child. The production of a liberated mother womanhood ought to coincide with the participation of women in social progress. And nevertheless, as the story unravels, we're witness to the limits of law and justice that morally code the options available to Virginia to chart maternity in absence of a man, or rather in the execution of the right to not love. Okay, and so then the third one, so love and labor. So this is the kind of the final section I've got of how I'm thinking about how she's articulating love in social problem as a social problem. And so here I draw attention to the last thread between love and politics, I think, in her work. And I think this is one of the meatiest one for sure, which has the underlying link of class. So the thread here is found in her positions on labor, which show up through really the length of all of her entries. It's very clear, both from her own writings as well as secondary literature on her writing, that Rodriguez Acosta was deeply committed to the importance of class analysis for understanding the plight of women, as well as the conditions of laboring classes and national social development writ large. And so for this reason, I stand comfortably in reasoning that her eye on labor connects to her more specific attention to the relationship between love, maternity, and marriage, Cuba as nation, as well as spiritual life, student activism, and the Machado dictatorship. Her attention to the intricate and intimate connections to labor in all facets of varying social problems undergirds my claim that Rodriguez Acosta was paying attention to what we contemporarily would call, right, social reproduction. And so one of the fundamental insights of social reproductive theory, and this is pulling from the introduction of Mapping Social Reproductive Theory, it came out in 2017, and this is a quote, the fundamental insight is, simply put, that human labor is at the heart of creating a reproducing society as a whole, end quote. So social reproductive theory reminds that the worker must also be produced in kin-based locales we commonly refer to as the family. Further, it's attentive to the fact that oppression is structurally relational to capitalist production rather than on its margins. And in the spirit, I want to suggest that part of what makes Rodriguez Acosta so unique in her insights is the way she's anticipating claims that are central to how we think about social reproduction today. The underlying capitalistic conditions that make marriage, love, maternity, as well as national economic issues so pressing at points of intervention for her writing. So she's attuned to the conditions by which the worker is produced. From this perspective, it's no surprise that she spends a great deal of ink on class, paying close attention to the origins of women's oppression as linked with the advent of capitalism. And so rather than divorce these topics, I think we can see them as threaded together. So at the level of nation, Rodriguez Acosta flags concerns with the relationship between Cuba and the United States, noting that the imperial capitalistic relationship with the US will have deep negative consequences. And she was not wrong about that. In this regard, she's flagging a very real social economic condition of Cuba that characterized not just the Machado dictatorship that she's in at this time, but also the broader history of Cuba-US relations, which are framed by imperial expansionist agenda. So much so, and this is a quote from her work, lo más terrible de la tragedia de Cuba no es la enmienda Platt, lo más terrible, lo más triste es que el imperialismo capitalista yanqui nos tiene atados con dogales enraizados ya en nuestra economía nacional. The most terrible aspect of Cuba's tragedy is not the Platt Amendment. The most terrible, the saddest thing is that Yankee capitalist imperialism has us tied with nooses deeply rooted in our national economy. Right, so you can, I mean, I think you start to see that she was very aware of the relationships with the United States. I'm not sure she would have anticipated an embargo, but the impact of something like an embargo, given the role of the United States in the Cuban economy post-independence. And so in this reflection, she's right about the way in which the US has, since the inception of the independent Cuban nation, been economically involved in its development. By the time Rodriguez Acosta is writing, however, the economic situation is growing dire. The Machado regime, framed by import substitution of light consumer goods and the funding for the development of an island oasis for tourism as mechanisms to pay for civic improvements, ultimately only benefited wealthy classes. Hence, the experience on the ground is one of growing poverty and resistance to the regime, which ultimately leads to state repression and the murder of a student activist named Rafael Trejo, and that was in 1930. And so these are rather exceptional circumstances of the Machado regime, which from historian Gillian McGilvray, she writes, Cuban presidents since 1902 had practiced graft and repression to varying degrees, but none before Machado had engaged in corruption under such dire economic conditions or employed such extensive state terrorism that included the murder of middle-class journalists, students, and political activists, end quote. And the state repression is another thing you can trace in Bohemia itself. They, as a newspaper magazine suspend writing for about a month or two during this time. And like you can, in the archives, you can see, right, they're like, we will not be publishing anything given the situation, right, for literal fear of their journalists dying, right? So, and this was very unprecedented. But this is another thing that's kind of cool that you can see in the archive of Bohemia is what's happening at the level of the Cuban nation and how this newspaper is responding to what's going on, taking stances, or just recording, right, in some way, shape, or form, what's happening with the Machado regime. Um, yeah. So and these are the types of economic conditions that she's speaking to. So that's a little bit of background about what's going on. So the discussion on the linking between love and labor, right? So I think I'm pulling a lot of this stuff from this essay, which is called Rebasando el Feminismo. This is one of the few from Bohemia that's actually published in book form. It's not translated, but it's been reproduced in a book format. Rebasando el feminismo or overcoming feminism, because it sits in the temporal frame of it's a very interesting place in the temporal frame of her publications. So this was published on the heels of a year's worth of entries about broader social and political issues. Rodriguez Acosta is responding to the political crisis of Cuba amidst the Machado dictatorship and the ongoing economic depression brought on by the destabilization of price of sugar after the Wall Street collapse in 1929. So you have her writing about the relationship with the United States, as I kind of just cited, but you also have the reality of the market collapsing in 1929. And so the US up until that time had consumed approximately 75% of Cuba's sugar exports. And the market collapse destabilized Cuba's economy as the US shifted to domestic beet production for its sugar consumption. The political landscape was, as noted, characterized by political unrest. The death of student activist Rafael Trejo marks the unfolding of a year of writing that focuses on broader social and political issues affecting Cuba: military war, rise of poverty, political repression. And so when she publishes this piece, she does so against this backdrop, which I think give us some interesting framing. And so in this essay, she tackles the feminist agenda and critically characterizes its efforts as misguided for appearing democratic, but in practice conserving aristocracy by committing the error of understanding feminism as a confrontation between men and women. In this way, the feminist movement in Cuba has deeply misunderstood the goal of feminism as a gendered confrontation, when in fact it ought to be a humanistic project, right? Back to that theme of the human that confronts life. A theme that I said is central to the corpus of her work. And so in this essay, life is an imperative of feminist practice, which the feminist movement has failed to enact. Feminism as an ideological movement needs to cut across all facets of life and not be divorced from the complexities therein. And so it encompasses all class situations, and more than a moral or political response, it is an economic response. And so she notes that life is measured rationally by economic responsibility. It comes from this essay. Given the foundational importance of economic freedom that she places on what it means to live a life freely, the questions of suffrage, for instance, which has framed bourgeois feminist movement of this time in Cuba, for her, I think she solves very, very little. And so she says, as long as feminism does not resolve, in addition to the issue of political and collective rights, the economic problem of women, it will not have fulfilled its mission. And so the mission of feminist politics requires attention to material conditions, and a failure to attend to the economic liberty runs the risk of mischaracterizing the project of feminism as one of gender conflict, rather than a project concerned with issues of systemic class inequality, more in a humanistic tone. And the latter is a way of characterizing her attention to life, generally speaking. The ultimate achievement of freedom and social progress is found in the capacity to recognize the humanity of others. This is the modernity that Rodriguez Acosta is seeking, one that confers humanity by attending to economic material conditions of those that are most disenfranchised. And so this essay closes out in a very interesting tone. The last quote, which is in italics, is also on the screen for you with a translation. But she cites Angelica Balabanov, who was a Russian-Italian communist and social democratic activist of Jewish origin. I've never seen this woman cited anywhere else, and I had to go digging really hard to find stuff, at least in the continental United States. Maybe if I go somewhere else, I might find publications of her more extensive work. But she was a prolific writer, and she published an autobiographical book called Días de Lucha, Recuerdos de mi vida, which was later published in English as My Life as a Rebel. But it was published and translated into Spanish first in 1931. It comes out in an English version in 1938. As My Life as a Rebel. And it's from this text that she closes out the essay. It's not the first time we see this individual cited. She was cited in the entry from a week prior to Rebasando el Feminismo, where she talks about confronting pain as a feature of human existence, and cites her there as well. And so this is worth reading. I'll read the English one just for the sake of time. Women's issues are also confused with social ones, and only a socialist society can solve them. The equality of the female part of humanity has always been axiomatic for me, but I've never felt more solidarity or affinity with women than with the oppressed. Moreover, I do not consider women true members of society with equal rights unless they are truly useful and sustain their own existence through their work. As for those who live off the labor of others, they are detestable to me as a parasite. And again, Rodriguez Acosta is making the case that a feminist project grounds itself in gender, presumes a commonality that's lacking for her an intersectional perspective, and also missing a social reproductive jest, the existence of those that makes the life of others possible. And so the folding in of this of Balabanov into the conversation entrenches the importance of economic liberty and practice for women, a thread that continues to show up throughout the length of her entries. In fact, it is through this thread that we witness the connections between human and the subject participant of the creation of material stability through labor. Labor marks the conditions by which the stipulations of marriage and family show up, so much so that the practice of love itself are transformed in and through its conditions. None of these argumentative points come to life without a recognition of the importance of labor and economic conditions that undergird what it means to be a woman in the first place. That is the labor that makes the worker possible in and through kinship organizations that we now know as the family. In an entry titled How Those Below Live, published nearly a year later, she pushes this claim further, noting that love doesn't even look the same under the conditions of extreme poverty and exploitation, right? So the conditions of modern life and social progress have come at great cost with the advent of capitalism, and capitalist exploitation conditions life at the order of social reproduction, altering the conditions for the possibilities of love. And then and this will be kind of the last one I know, entry that is called The Maternal Right. She directly engages with the work of Frederick Engels. This was published in 1932, in which she opens with a reflection on a treatise arguing that it's a necessary read to clear the mental cobwebs for those who believe in the divine origin of the family. In an expose of Engels, she walks her readers through a synopsis of Engels' treatise and reminds that the rights that the feminist movement has focused on acquiring for women have not always been in absence, but rather created through the conditions of capitalism that destroyed the matrilineal ordering of kinship characteristic of the world prior to the advent of private property. And she firmly defends Engels, claiming that the origin of the family is purely economic. The outcome of the rise of the modern nuclear family coheres around a practice of monogamy, which guaranteed men paternal power and control over the transference of wealth. Hence, there's nothing natural or divine about the situation that women find themselves in with respect to the family, marriage, and practices of love. They are historically contingent phenomenon anchored in the advent of class society. In some, love is ultimately linked to economic conditions. The core of the problem is found in the link between love and labor that will, unless socioeconomically addressed, continue to characterize women's plights in the world. Love, as it turns out, is just as modern as the advent of class society, and as she demonstrates, it's a key site for the articulation of class values. Hence, if socioeconomic conditions are not addressed, very little changes. So just in closing, right, I think part of what she's up to is that she's aiming to think with the possibilities of love in a different way, right? This is another quote: love as a truth, as a natural right, a liberty, a way of knowing, and not a slavery of choice that molds a whole life. Love exceeds fidelity to a man. It's also the right to not love. Love is conditioned by class, is a social problem indeed. And it's a social problem that flags the conditions that make kinship possible, where kinship in the times of Rodriguez Acosta sculpted the concept of the modern family, marriage, and monogamy as it might still be today. one of the beautiful facets of her writing is the visionary nature of change as she thinks is possible. So possible, in fact, that we must start training for the future yet to come. And so to do so requires the recognition that love is a social problem framed by economic conditions that make it show up as meaningful in the first place. Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you so much for a very